get started. Welcome, Rumble. I do want to say something. I had a funny happen this morning. We take those where we can get them. So just so that you guys know a little bit more, not that you care. When I was on active duty, my nickname, if you will, was Strawberry Princess. And that's because I'm in love with strawberries, just like on everything. My china pattern strawberries, my kitchen's done in strawberries, blah, blah, blah. So um, that's all because I grew up going to Plant City, Florida, which is the headquarters of the Florida Strawberry Festival. It is also the winter strawberry capital of the world. They produce more winter strawberries than any place on earth. And as a little kid, that was kind of a family thing that we did. We'd go over there for days on end and pick strawberries, and we'd have a production line of putting them all up for the year and freezing them, blah, blah, blah. So I'm in love with strawberries. And I'm wearing over on Rumble my favorite strawberry sweatshirt because this morning it was 30 degrees here. And today, well, every year it's a 10-day long county fair. And they have 2 concerts every day at 3:30 and 7:30. And it's a very small venue, so it's really good seats no matter where you're at. But because they have some really cool people come every year, I think it's like the second Thursday, whatever today is in the month is, that's kind of every year they put the tickets on sale at 8:00 on the same day. So they went on sale this morning. And so at like 7:50, my husband has his laptop up. I have my laptop up. We both have our phones going because we've had problems with computers in the past. And if you want to get really good seats, you have to get on there like first. So I looked at him and I said, you know what? I have more anxiety right now than I do reading books about my entire government being corrupt. So anyway, we got tickets. We're going to see Reba. We're going to see Leonard Skinner, and all kinds of really cool concerts this year. So all of our tickets are bought and we're ready to go. Who's the other one? Shoot, I don't know. My mind's blank right now. I know I can look it up real quick because I want y'all to know just how fun this thing is. Let's see. Sarah Evans is going to be there. Sawyer Brown, John Fogerty, and John Party. And I already told you Reba. And I already told you Leonard Skinner. So those are the ones that we're going to go to. And we have a friend from Detroit that owns a condo down here because, of course, Lakeland is also the spring training for the Detroit Tigers. So there's a lot of Michiganders down here in the spring. And he flies down here for the Strawberry Festival every year. So we coordinated with him, got tickets to all the same concerts. So life is good. Anyway, and that's pretty much the only entertainment that we do for the whole year. So we just like pack it all in to those 10 days. Also, just so that you know, that's where originally all of my jewelry came from the Strawberry Festival. There was a lady from Maine that came down every year for like the last 30 years and was like the primary jewelry vendor there. I got to be very good friends with her. And I got married to my husband at the Strawberry Festival, and she threw a reception for us there. And we went to Maine to visit her. We just met so many lifelong friends at that place because it's like the old-fashioned county fairs. It's a lot of fun. So anyway, not that you needed to know that. I wanted to explain why I have my strawberry sweatshirt on. And one of these days, I'll wear my strawberry blue jean jacket because every year at the Strawberry Festival, they issue a themed pin, like the little pins you put in your hat. And every year they pick a different theme for the Strawberry Festival. And I have like probably 40 pens. It's like it's been going on for like 75 years. And I have like the last 40 years worth of pens all on one jacket that has like um crystal stuff all over it. And of course, it's got strawberry paraphernalia on it. So I'll have to wear that one day so you guys can see it. It's amazing. All right, we're going to jump in to chapter 25, which is Bush versus Casey. So the one thing that Casey and George Bush Sr. could both agree on is that they hated Jimmy Carter and what he had done to the CIA. That was about it. And Ted Shackley, obviously, not a good guy. And Ted Shackley was hell-bent on figuring out a way to work around Congress so that when they put the stop on funding Nicaragua, the Contras, and they also prohibited the funding of Angola. And so we know from our other studies that what the CIA did was use Israel as a weapons trafficker and use them to do arms deals in other countries. So, all right, badass shows, ma'am, sandwiches, Alpha, and the hamster. Yep, I keep good company, that's for sure. All right, so young conservatives who had yearned for a chance to bring down the system installed by the Democrats now had their chance with both Bush and Bill Casey. So Casey, who was already starting to operate all over the world again, and Bush, who wanted to solidify his political powerhouse because, of course, he wants to be president after Reagan. Worldwide efforts were begun instantaneously to put politicians all over the world aligned with their fascist beliefs in power. I added the word fascist. No country was safe. From Egypt to Guatemala to Poland to Afghanistan to Spain to Angola to Nicaragua, every liberal government needed to be replaced. To fund these operations, no government, including those in Iran and Iraq, was too unscrupulous to do business with. Excuse me. Even countries that supported terrorism or unfavorable leaders like Saddam Hussein was fair game to be in the business with. Law firms, not unlike Sullivan and Cromwell, Senate and House offices, PR firms like Hill and Knowlton, and lobbying outfits all became places to work for CIA assets who were preparing their jackboot foot soldiers to spread what these guys call, quote unquote, conservative governments. Indiana Senator Dan Quayle was one of those who agreed to park operatives inside his office. This practice further compromised, because at the time he's an Indiana senator, keep in mind. This practice further compromised intelligence oversight, and often the congressman or senator had no idea these young people were there as part of a CIA operation. Many of their names would emerge years later in government scandals. People like Rob Owen, Neil Livingstone, and Carter Clues. Now, I have their names written down. We're going to come back to them. If I don't get to it today, we will do it tomorrow. In 1981, Casey summoned retired intel officer Robert Crowley, which is one of the guys that donated the papers for this book, and a retired colleague from New York to his office in Langley. Crowley's age had not diminished either his physical presence, he stood 6 feet, over 6 feet tall, or his wit. Crowley had been the unnamed guest at 1,000 corporate executive suites during his CIA career. Because keep in mind, Crowley's whole job, we learned in this book, was the intermediary between CIA and corporations where they embedded their assets, like PepsiCo, ITT, all of the ones that we have learned, Freeport. Crowley is the one that set those arrangements up. So Casey wanted to reawaken the romance between American corporations and CIA in order to plant his new intelligence army in nations around the world. Casey's plan was to rekindle the old OSS spirit in the CIA and begin a kind of corporate sponsored CIA activity that had been abandoned after the public exposure of ITT's role in the overthrow of Allende. Wasn't just ITT, it was Freeport and PepsiCo too. And they basically paid to overthrow the government. Covert action would no longer be limited to the professionals in the CIA. The technicians who had professional intelligence backgrounds could supervise new amateur army of assets. Crowley was more than dubious. Crowley thought Casey remarkably uninformed on how security law for someone who had once actually headed the Security and Exchange Commission. Casey's proposals seemed to totally conflict with many of the shareholder laws that had led to discovery of businesses' connections to the CIA in the first place. Although Crowley explained to Casey the new SEC regulations and the possibility of shareholder lawsuits, all but ruled out a cooperation to the extent that he was talking about. There were exceptions to that when it came to private companies. Casey continued to push Crowley to come back from his retirement and run the effort. To Crowley's surprise, during a Saturday afternoon meeting in the DCI's office, Deputy Director Bobby Ray Inman sat passively as Casey made his pitch to Crowley. Also present, Crowley said, was a small and rather callow young man who interjected himself into the conversation by the name of Robert Gates. Gates had received his reward for his role in helping the Reagan-Bush campaign while working in the Carter White House. John Bross, who we met last time, Bross, had recommended Gates as a personal deputy to Casey. He was obviously a puppy raised by Casey. Crowley had prepared a letter for Casey outlining all of the problems he should consider before he reinstituted the program. So Crowley gave him the letter and started to walk to the door. And he said that he thought there was a lot of good things going on, a lot of changes, and asked if I had an interest in coming back. Crowley said no. Close to the elevator, Casey, an arm twister in the Lyndon Johnson tradition, put his arm on Crowley's shoulder and said, with his suit coat pulled up around his armpits, because Crowley is much taller than Casey. He says, basically, Casey says to Crowley, thanks for coming out. Crowley says, anytime, and left. He had no doubt that he did not give Casey what he wanted. Casey would find others who would work instead. The story of Robert Keith Gray is illustrative of how intelligence and business operated during the Reagan and Bush administration. Now, keep in mind, this whole Robert Keith Gray story is how this was my first, like a year and a half ago. My first exposure to the CIA using PR firms was Robert Keith Gray. He's not just a PR guy. He's a CIA asset. He's the guy that ran the brothel in Washington, D.C. So Bob Gray not only was a friend of Bill Casey's, he had worked with him on the 1980 campaign, notably specifically hired for the October surprise. Right after Reagan's inauguration, Gray started his own PR firm called Gray and Company. Within a year, he had established an international division, which tells you this was all about him working for the CIA. Neil Livingstone was one of Gray's employees. While he was there, he worked on many projects unrelated to PR. Livingstone said that he played a key role in supporting what? The anti-communist activities. You know, Operation Gladio. In where? Eastern Europe. And that he was a part of the CIA's operation inside of Solidarity in Poland. Now, what's interesting, and again, God does this, right? So God showed me the AFL-CIO's role in all of this. So we just exposed all of the union shenanigans. And then we get to the part in this story where Solidarity was a labor movement and it was co-opted by the AFL. And this guy is right in the middle of it. So it's crazy how we get led to these exposure things and they all just keep piling on top of each other like a well-oiled puzzle being put together so we can see with clarity all of how all of this operates. Crowley explained that it was an incestuous relationship, but we were doing it on the CIA's dime, and that Gray was basically not using any of his company resources to do it. Certainly, everyone knew what everybody else was doing. All of the people were carrying the administration's water through this operation. Through the 1980s, the number of people carrying the administrative water grew, and the scope of their efforts reached around the world. With the expansion, Casey and Bush became even more reliant on Shackley and his outside friends, especially for the two adventures that became known as Iran-Contra and the Iraq Gate scandal. Livingstone put together a dubious cast of characters to carry out the missions under his authority. Among others, he hired Rob Owen, who had absolutely no qualifications in PR work at all. He was hired to run the Iran-Contra inside of Gray's operation. Because Bush and Casey were trying to run their operations out of their hip pocket, the normal criminal counterintelligence and factual checks were not done. They found themselves relying on politically motivated zealots. For example, one of Gray's representatives in Spain was Carter Clews, Clews, first name Carter. He was basically what would I call him? He was part of the fascist government of Franco, and definitely not a good guy. He would have been one of those guys that interacted with Otto Skorzeny, who was there in Spain along with Franco. As the operations grew around the world, the personal rivalries continued. George Shultz, Alexander Haig's replacement as Secretary of State, was barely on speaking terms with Secretary of Defense Caspar Weinberger, and the relationship between Casey and his deputy, Bobby Ray Inman, was bad. Casey first realized that Inman was secretly reporting on CIA activities to Bush when President Reagan ordered a copy of his own and Bush's appointment schedules delivered to a handful of president's closest advisors. Casey was on that list, and he was outraged when he saw Inman's name regularly on Bush's schedule. According to a guy by the name of Joseph Persico, Persico's biography, an angry Casey burst into Inman's office one morning and demanded to know why he had been so to see Bush so many times. Persico wrote, quote, Inman struggled for the cool demeanor that he had learned to master and responded, he wants me to. He's the vice president. He can be helpful, and I intend to keep on doing it, unquote. Of course, that made the entire situation ridiculous. Bush believed he was manipulating the rogues and through Inman was learning everything that was going on inside the CIA. Casey believed that Inman and Bush were in a collusion to deny Ronald Reagan his foreign policy that he wanted. The old line veterans at the CIA were shocked to see men like Shackley and Klein being welcomed into Casey's inner circle. Shackley and his partners now had their tentacles throughout the foreign policy side of the administration. Shackley and Klein's had held out a hand to the new CIA director, and Casey had accepted it. Caspar Weinberger liked to delegate authority. Fritz von Marbach and Richard Secord understood what he wanted and knew how to give it to him. General Stilwell, top secret operation at the Pentagon, had several high-level officials who were very sympathetic to this situation. They were also very sympathetic to Israel and ran behind-the-scenes defense intelligence programs. Inman warned Casey about some of his associates, but Casey was in no mood to listen. It seemed almost everyone was ready to basically backstab everybody else. Bush had remained close to Nixon over the years, and the two men met often during the 1980 campaign. Nixon earned the loyalty of the Reagan people during a bizarre episode in the 1980 Republican National Convention in Detroit. It ended on July 18th. 1 week later, Nixon traveled to London to meet a British citizen by the name of Alan Bristow, who had run a small helicopter fleet called Bristow Helicopters. He did that in Iran for 20 years, working for the Shah. Bristow was a strange person for a former president to even know. Bristow had lobbied for a British Strategic Air Service operation to help him get all of his helicopters back, which had been impounded once Iran was taken over by when they kicked the Shah out. When the revolutionaries relented and returned his fleet, Bristow agreed to stop lobbying for the raid. It was at this point that he agreed to meet with Nixon, who used the U.S. Embassy in London as his office. Nixon kept repeating that something had to be done about the American hostages. Bristow said that he had warned Nixon that at best, any second rescue force could anticipate 30% casualties. Nixon told Bristow that President Carter would not have the nerve to try another rescue mission, and that is why Nixon, was exploring the idea. For Bristow, the meeting with Nixon had a weird quality to it. Bristow didn't know, though, that Nixon probably did, that the Bush connection and that Richard Secord was actually planning a second mission. But later goes on to say that nothing came of it. Nixon steadfastly refused to talk about the meeting. Security records reveal the presence of both men at the U.S. Embassy. One thing was clear: the Republicans' preoccupation with the hostages during the campaign went beyond even Casey's extensive knowledge. Once Reagan and Bush were elected, Nixon played a large, though secret, role in early foreign and intelligence policies. Like the rogues, CIA agents, Nixon was yet another component to a private intelligence community that Bush was setting up. Many Nixon associates like Frank Carlucci, Robert McFarland also played public roles in the administration. Members of Nixon's former administration, including Marine aide Colonel Jack Brennan, who we've ran across several times, his Attorney General John Mitchell, and his Vice President Spiro Agnew had set up a series of businesses that were all engaged in military sales, which is what General Secord got put in charge of. Nixon, in effect, became a frontman for these companies and wrote letters to heads of state encouraging them to do business with those companies. With that effort, Nixon became part of the outside intelligence network. His true role as a facilitator for Brennan and Mitchell, when they became part of the Reagan administration's secret tilt towards Iraq, did not even get discovered for many years. While Casey sorted through personal folders at the CIA to recruit old operatives back into the network, Bush was a traditionalist who had no hesitation about using his own circle of friends out of the vice president's office to carry out operations, because he used his own private network, which included his former Yale classmates, which kind of lends right into the skull and bones conversation we just had today at noon with Warhamster. So, for example, in the mid-1980s, Bush contacted a classmate by the name of William Draper, Draper, who was head of the Export-Import Bank, which is a big deal, and urged him to approve funding for Iraq, a complete reversal of the bank's position. At the time, the bank felt that Iraq was a basket case, and they were. After Bush's phone call, the bank approved the loan. When George and Barbara Bush arrived in Washington after the election, they stayed at George's old Yale roommate, Jonathan W. Sloat, Sloat. Sloat was a Washington attorney who basically loved entertaining foreign Yale classmates. In 1980, Sloat was affiliated with Shaw, Pittman, Potts, and Trowbridge. That law firms come up quite often too. The law firm became so important to the CIA in its business dealings with branch offices that there was one established in McLean, Virginia, right down the road from Langley. Jonathan Sloat's relationship with Bush symbolized the way Bush and his friends looked at business and the government as working in a partnership. Sloat spent Bush's 2 terms as vice president moving in and out of various agencies, including the U.S. Information Agency, which is a CIA front, the Department of Labor, NASA, which is where they housed all the Nazis, and as a government attorney. In some of the agencies, Bush cronies wanted to do business. For example, Sloat was at NASA when an old Yale chum of Bush's decided that he wanted to invest in a company that was going to privatize the U.S. space shuttles, kind of like Elon Musk did. They were, in effect, trying to make billions of dollars out of selling shuttles after U.S. taxpayers had spent billions financing the R&D to do so. So basically, they were going to use our tax dollars to do all of the work, and then they were going to get all the profits. Shaw, Pittman, Potts, and Trowbridge served as a haven for 2 key partners that were affiliated with this private network. Barbara Rossotti, Rossotti, was the lawyer Tom Clines hired to organize his company called International Research and Trade, the company that had originally been funded by Ed Wilson and Ted Shackley organized, which became EATSCO. So basically, she's doing the paperwork for CIA front companies, much like Sullivan and Cromwell did. Rosati had graduated magna cum laude from Mount Holyoke College and then went on to Harvard Law School. After working at Sloat and Rosati, there was a young man by the name of William Barr. Barr was a New Yorker and had graduated from Columbia University and completed his law degree at George Washington University. Back in 1977, he had worked in the office of the General Counsel to the CIA, which of course we know. In 1982, Barr was appointed Deputy Assistant Director of the Office of Policy Development at the White House. 1982. So that's at the beginning of the Reagan administration, which came in 81. As the sins of the private network were threatening to spill out in public, Bush's own administration, Bush turned to Barr to first serve as Assistant Attorney General for the Office of Legal Counsel this is when Bush becomes president, from 89 to 90, and then his Attorney General. Barr nearly succeeded in covering up Bush's role in Iraqgate. Meanwhile, in a parallel private intelligence community that Casey was trying to run with ex-military and intelligence people, they became the foot soldiers of a political and religious so they identified some political and religious organizations that they wanted to infiltrate. And Casey was hiring previous intelligence people and military people to do that job. These were the most secret and political of private intelligence operations. When Iran-Contra became a scandal in November 1986, these legions continued to operate for Reagan, while commissions and committees and everybody else was looking over here. They continued this covert operation out of sight that they didn't even know to even talk about because it was so covertly done. To motivate these new troops, Casey preached a steady diet of how the increasing threat of communism in the U.S. during the Carter administration, and that it was going to come back to haunt us. And so we had to step up our efforts to combat the communism that didn't exist, at least in America. Casey did not share with them the details of the October surprise or secrets like the cocaine trafficking that was going to pay for all of it. To utilize the talents of all of these new people, the administration used disciples like Richard, and I'm not sure how you say this guy's last name. I'm going to spell it Viguerie, Vigorari, the direct mail consultant and PR executive Robert Gray. Casey had an eye for talent. He also recruited John Carbogh, Carbaugh. He was a lesser known but key figure that served as a bridge between Republican entities and intelligence agencies. Carbogh was not an ordinary lawyer. According to his former law partner, who is William Joyce, Joyce, he was a ruthlessly ambitious man that had sympathies for most of the oppressive dictators around the world. He had a profound effect on the privatization of covert operations. What that tells me is that he was a plant in that law firm working on Operation Gladio stuff. Working out of this law office was also Richard Nixon's committee to re-elect the president. It has an acronym called CREEP, which is CREEP. Gotta love that. Carbogh pioneered alliances overseas, not with the US government, but between American organizations and their counterpart in their other countries. Human rights abuses, even acts of torture and murder, didn't matter. Many people saw Carbog as a brash lawyer and potential politician. He developed a reputation as a man behind the success of Senator Jesse Helms, which I find very interesting because Jesse Helms was one of the key people. He's a gatekeeper for intelligence. He put himself in the way of finding out a lot of this information a whole lot sooner. In fact, Carbog was not even a Southerner. He was born in Pennsylvania. His mother was a religious fundamentalist and his father a Catholic. He earned his credentials when his father became an accountant for the Bob Jones University. God, this stuff just keeps overlapping, doesn't it? In South Carolina. Carbog was transformed into a model Bob Jones creation when he married his high school sweetheart. Carbog was a $45,000 a year aide to Senator Helms when he met Washington lawyer William Joyce through a mutual friend. Joyce liked Carbog's brashness and his willingness to work hard. Carbog moved into the offices of Vance and Joyce, which was the name of the law firm, but insisted on running his affairs as a separate operation that shared expenses with other lawyers, but not the profits. To my great surprise, shortly after Carbog came to the firm, his fifth-floor office was visited by some technicians. They installed combination locks on his office, and that was a very strange thing, Joyce said, because he's not working for that company. It's a front company, and he's working for the CIA. Joyce watched Carbog's financial status quickly and dramatically change. Another telltale sign. Soon, Carbog left his wife and married one of his secretaries, who was a descendant of John C. Calhoun. Can't make this shit up. It's probably his handler, by the way. He purchased a house that cost well over $2 million near Senator Edward Kennedy's Virginia estate. Joyce, not a nervous man by nature, was growing more curious about Carbog's use of his law firm. The curiosity reached its peak when Cuban-born Reagan appointee Alberto Martinez Pedro began telling Joyce that Carbog was playing a major role in a covert operation. There was no way for Joyce to know that among Carbog's assignment was the job of keeping George Bush honest in terms of agenda on which Ronald Reagan ran. Casey wanted enough on Bush to keep Bush in line. William Corson said the following, quote, "To Casey, Bush was the spoiled son of a father who had a good sense to marry well. The discovery that Bush had vulnerabilities that could destroy a political career wasn't difficult. Bush had been very indiscreet in several ways," unquote. Carbog did not recruit operatives only from Capitol Hill. Once, when Senator Helms was going through some of his thunder and fire about unacceptable ambassador appointments that had been sent up to the Foreign Relations Committee, Helms vowed to block 3 of these appointments. One of them was Lewis Glenn Fields Jr., who was a veteran of the State Department, who had been appointed as ambassador to disarmament talks in Geneva. Fields, who had been an Agency for International Development, AID, in Vietnam, was also an intelligence asset. He and Bush had become friends during Bush's days at the CIA. Field had worked with Bush in the areas of State Department security and narcotics. And that's not like preventing narcotics, that's trafficking narcotics. Field's office featured a display of letters and photographs of him with Bush. When Fields found that his appointment was being blocked by Helms, he looked up his old friend William Joyce and asked him to intercede with Carbog, not only on his behalf, but also on behalf of the other two block nominees. Joyce refused. I told Fields that I knew him, but not the others. He pleaded with me to speak to Carbog about the other three, or about the other two and him. I told him that he was foolish and that he should not worry about saving himself. He told me that he had to think about it. A couple of weeks later, he called and asked for my help. I set up a luncheon for the three of us. Carbog got to know Fields. It was like magic. Helms suddenly withdrew his opposition in Fields' appointment, and Lou was on his way to Geneva. The magic may have been less to do with the magic magnetism than the fact that Fields offered a way for Casey through Carbog to keep an eye on his rivals at the State Department, including George Shultz. Shultz seemed to be blocking everything Casey wanted to do. Carbog had another reason for being interested in Fields. According to another Jesse Helms aide who read through Fields' file, Fields was a CIA operative that was very close to George Bush and was in a position to let them know everything that was going on. It didn't hurt that Fields had been an administrative assistant to Senator Willis Robertson of Virginia, who is a televangelist and the father of Pat Robertson. All right, so I'm going to say that again. Fields had been an administrative assistant to Senator Willis Robertson, who's the father of Pat Robertson. So Pat Robertson's dad is working with Fields, and they're all CIA assets. So what I find most interesting about that is Pat Robertson, in the book that I'm reading, Thou Will Be Done, about Nelson Rockefeller and his use of all of these religious icon people. Pat Robertson's name comes up all the time as basically being one of these people that are involved in this intelligence co-opting of Latin America. Years later, it slowly began to dawn on Joyce that Carbog may have recruited Fields for his own purpose. Carbog had no great affection for George Bush, Joyce said, and Lou bragged about his friendship with Bush. He says, it never dawned on me that they would use Fields to get stuff on Bush, but looking back on it, that's exactly what they did. So, crazy, all of the machinations that goes on in order as they all quickly try to get dirt on everyone else. Blackmail is how the entire thing works. And that's why people like Jeffrey Epstein was so critically important to this entire operation. So anyway, let me put my screen back over here. Bridget, SR71, did you guys have anything that you wanted to add, or any of the links that you put up, anything that you wanted to draw attention to?
I think you could write a book on each one of these guys. I mean, every time I open, and we're digging while you're going, they weren't just involved in one thing. It was like as soon as they got exposed in one thing, they just moved over to another agency and started again, doing something totally different but equally as nefarious. I posted several that came from the CIA's website, but they are sanitized. So you always have to read these things with your Gladio glasses on and kind of read between the lines. This is what they're approving. But even what they're approving is pretty damning.
Yes. Yes, exactly.
what I found most interesting out of all of this is the jockeying for position and what's going on. Obviously, not everybody's on the same page, and least of all Bush, for some reason. That's why they're after him.
Yeah, I mean, that obviously is very interesting from the perspective that you can see that they want to control whoever has control. And I guess that's kind of the biggest takeaway for me is nowhere in anything that, and I mean we've read some fairly boring books about the CIA, at least I have. Nowhere in there do I ever hear them talking about actual intelligence collection for the national security of the United States ever. It's never even a topic. I'm a year and a half into this. Never once has any of these missions had anything to do with the national security of America. Every single one of them, as you can see with the embedding in these corporations and making sure that these corporations are able to operate in foreign countries. And if they can't, you overthrow the government. None of that has anything to do with the national security of America. It has everything to do with supporting the oligarchs making money off of cheap labor.
The other thing I found interesting was a little bit I read about Jesse Helms from what I posted in the film.
Uh-huh.
That guy is something else. He was involved in a whole bunch of junk.
He was. You want to highlight a few of them?
Well, I noticed that he attended some session or another with all of the major criminal elements, from child trafficking or human trafficking to drug trafficking to you name it. They were all there. Why he was there in the first place, didn't say.
Because he's in the middle of all of it.
And that Vigieri, that Richard Vigieri.
Yep.
It goes to show you the uniparty. This isn't a Democratic or Republican thing. This is a uniparty thing where he's on, in that particular case, he did a lot of books where the new right, we're leading, we're ready to lead and to weaken the CIA when he's actually involved with the CIA.
Correct.
So, it's just, and then their children. One of the people that you had brought up, I don't know if I kept the tab open, but in many cases, their son, will end up going on to fill another, it'll be a PR or a lawyer, and they will be also involved in the more recent day thing.
It's definitely generational.
Absolutely.
All along, go ahead.
Yeah, it struck me, Colonel, that when you're describing Nixon's rule in London in 1979 or 1980, it's like, wow, how ironic. Again, you can see some continuity between this 1968 October surprise and the 1980 October surprise. Although, correct me if I'm wrong, you may have been describing the efforts to infiltrate / sabotage the rescue attempt by Jimmy Carter. I may be mistaken there. But
well, the October surprise is the calling off of the rescue. So that it was the secret negotiation that went on by the Reagan administration to allow Iran to continue to hold, or to try to bribe them into, with weapons, to holding on to the hostages until after the election.
Right. And it just reminds me of, what a kind of fascinating, obviously sort of dipstick, if you will, that Richard Nixon is into CIA history. I mean, 1946, he's already getting money from the East Coast Republican factions, including Allen Dulles, for his congressional campaign at the very beginning.
Right.
And then he is like, some people I've heard, said, obviously he was aligned with CIA for a long, long time, but some have argued possibly he angered some folks by not naming George W. Bush Treasury Secretary in 1968. And of course, there are a number of other things that Nixon did to, anger the CIA too, which led to Watergate, the CIA's operation to defenestrate Richard Milhouse Nixon. But also the other thing that you mentioned is George Shultz. I mean, this guy is a sneaky one. He seems to be much less outspoken, unlike some folks, perhaps knows when to hold his tongue. And he's in the Nixon administration, and then he's, within a key faction in the Reagan administration. He's just a guy who is deserving of a lot more, close scrutiny. Although there's been books about him. He's not like there's been ink spilled about him, but I think there's a lot more WTF to be discovered about this guy.
I would tend to agree with you. He has a, I mean, the fact that he existed as far back as the Eisenhower administration and was part of the economic advisors, which, if you ask me, that's the economic hit team that was going around all of the countries like the Congo and was being coerced into playing to the oligarchs in the West, because that's basically what it amounted to. So, yeah, in his stint at the Treasury and all of that other stuff, during some very critical times, he definitely is one that you could probably spend an entire couple of shows on, just showing, because of course he was on the global quote unquote drug policy thing, which is all bullshit because they're running the drug operations. He was part of Bechtel, which we know what that is. He is one of the very core international syndicate players. And the fact that he ends up in that Theranos scandal as well. I mean, come on. Who hits all of those? Because to me, Theranos was just a money laundering operation. That's all it was. Just like the Sam Bankman-Fried money laundering. Miles, go ahead.
Good afternoon, Colonel. So in your research, have you found anything like, because we had intel services before the CIA, the corrupt intel agency, were they trying to counteract them right away? And was Joseph McCarthy actually calling them out without really saying their name? Because there had to be other intel agencies that knew that from the start this was going to be bad.
So not intel agencies per se. So what you find if you go back prior to 1948, and really prior to the war, is you find the model that they used like in Hawaii and in the Philippines and in Puerto Rico and Cuba. And that model was that they are going to go in. I mean, they did it in Panama. And Panama is probably one of the most interesting ones in how they stole Panama from Colombia. You basically did it through companies and law firms and navies. And so all of these entities would be your forward deployed spying people. So a U.S. company like United Fruit or whatever, PepsiCo, ITT, which was telephone companies, would go into these countries and pay off all of the elite and the political people. I mean, they had a saying that in one of those countries in Latin America, it was cheaper to buy a donkey, or cheaper to buy a senator than it was to buy a donkey. And so they would go in and buy the political quote unquote leaders in the country. Then they were allowed to go in and either corruptly buy land if it was United Fruit, or they bought up industry, and then they instituted spies in that. So it's like a spear. The first guys in may be the guys that's going to take over the telephone company. That way they can spy on everything. Then they're going to fund their local newspaper. Then they're going to create a bank, and then they're going to fund a harbor improvement that includes building a customs house. But the deal is that you have to allow us to run the customs house, which means we can strangle you anytime we want to, because we control all of your import and exports, which is how they knew to create the import-export bank, because that's what they had been doing by building the custom houses in Nicaragua, Guatemala, Chile, all of those places. So this model that they used prior to World War II was just basically packaged up and sat inside of the CIA. It was all of the same things, but everything that they were doing prior to World War II, in the way in which they were doing it, was illegal. They weren't even allowed to be doing any of the stuff that they were doing. And there were people that went to jail when they were caught doing some of this stuff, and they were killed. So what they wanted was, they wanted the protection of being placed inside. They're a mafia. They're a legalized mafia that has been placed inside the US government and pretends to be an intelligence agency. Does that help?
So are you saying that there's never been a pushback before Kennedy?
No. I mean, the only two people that were before Kennedy was Truman and Eisenhower, and they were involved in setting it up. And before that, you had, I mean, for as far back as Teddy Roosevelt was involved in it. I mean, as early as the 1890s, we went to Hawaii and did this. And our State Department guy is the one that told him to do it. So most of these operations, from a government perspective, because the government was colluding with all of this, it all came out of the State Department. And that's why when Warhamster points out that Nelson Aldrich Rockefeller's named after Aldrich, which is the former Secretary of State, it was his dad that was involved in this before the war, or, his grandfather, actually. Before the war, all of these operations from the government perspective was ran out of the State Department. John Foster Dulles was involved. And then his, who's his grandfather? He had a grandfather that was involved in all of this as well. And I can't think of his name right now. Lansing. But they keep it close in the family.
Well, I know a lot of people don't like the Kennedy family. I experienced that when I was younger. But if you look at Joe Kennedy, he knew all those people. He worked with those people. And if I'm right, when he went over to meet with Churchill, he didn't want us to get into World War II, because when you look at, they were setting things up in Europe and over here to, because Operation Paperclip. Now, I don't know if Kennedy knew anything about that, but he even sent a memo or a telegram back to the U.S. If the ship that I'm on sinks, Churchill sank it.
So but, I think if you go back in time, and again, I've read different views of Joe Kennedy. Joe Kennedy was definitely in the criminal syndicate. He was into the bootlegging, and he had his own mafia contacts. He was deeply embedded in it. There are some people that believe that he wanted his son to be president to basically take over the operational aspects of the syndicate. There are other people that firmly believe that he saw too much of the corruption and wanted his sons, both of them, to fix it. Now, you are free to do your own research and come up with your own conclusions. What we know happened is, regardless of whether it was at the insistence of his father or not, once he had his father's support in becoming president, because that was part of it. He's the one that got the unions to do all of the vote running. Once JFK was president, you can make the argument that if he was there to perpetuate and kind of just be the, the playboy in office, enjoy life and be the president while all this shit went on underneath of him, if that was his intention, and I'm not suggesting that it was, but if it was, it didn't last very long. And what he saw was so gross that he consciously began fighting the system and lost. So again, just reading history, it's clear he fought the system. At what point he began fighting the system, you can make an argument on when that happened, but it definitely happened. Oh,
Colonel?
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, on that Joe Kennedy note, I mean, I think you're correct in summarizing the ambivalence about him. I think, it can very easily be overstated, the influence of, his mob connections. There's a number of reasons for doing that, right? You have your, bash everything Kennedy crowd who wants to, imply that everything involved with JFK was about the mafia and not some other, higher class folks, ... And then you have, but also I think it's critical to remember, around the time of 1938, 39, 40, in the U.S. press, you had, an absolutely fierce, throw everything, including the kitchen table and sink, at each other, argument between the interventionists and the anti-interventionists, right? And that just involved, incredible numbers of sort of liberals, New Deal type liberals, but who were also getting more corporate war contracting connections. So it's a fascinating crossover of groups that, started out in New Deal, but
let me add something to what you just said, though, because that's where I really get mine. It's not really even the bootlegging thing. It is the easiest low-hanging fruit. But if you go back, I don't know if you're familiar, or even if the people listening are familiar, so I'm going to tell you. There is a very weird thing that goes on between anybody that's appointed from the United States to be the ambassador to the UK. There's like an induction into a secret society club. There's all kinds of weird associations there. Joe Kennedy was the US ambassador to the UK for FDR. FDR was not a good guy. And so if you look at his role in the administration of FDR, particularly the Maritime Commission, which, is drug related, and the moving of goods around. And also he goes on to be the SEC person. Well, I think he did that first, if I'm not mistaken. So he's in the Security Exchange, which we know there's a lot of shenanigan in the banking world that goes on there. So Joe Kennedy knew his way around Washington, D.C. He knew who all of the players were. He was a big, big deal.
No doubt. And also, I would just recommend this biography by NASA. I put it in the bubble. It's a fairly recent one, and he kind of looks into some of the allegations about Joe Kennedy. He says he investigates, was Joe Kennedy, as some said, really pro-Hitler, or on the other hand, was he simply anti-interventionist? And he makes the argument that NASA seems to think that the argument that he was pro-Hitler or pro-fascist is vastly overstated by propagandists of the likes who were on the so-called left New Deal, but later moved into the MICC during the Cold War, because he says, look, cut to the Korean War, Joe Kennedy was just as anti-interventionist as as during World War II. And also he makes a pretty good argument, in my opinion, of rebutting claims that most of Joe Kennedy's fortune came from bootlegging. Now, look, I'm not denying at all that, there's obviously connections there, but NASA argues that most of Joe Kennedy's fortunes came from financing RKO Studios when they were making the transition.
It did.
From to sound movies.
It did.
And that was a massive investment that was arranged through by Joe Kennedy. So I strongly recommend this book. I'm not saying that Joe Kennedy was a saint or far from it, but it's just like there's so much mafia stuff thrown at him, and you wonder who some of those banana peel slingers are working for, and what is their real motive. So
I think there's a combination. I think both things can be true. I think things are overstated in many areas, but here's one of the particular things about him that I found very interesting. He happened to be Joe Kennedy, and whether this is just the Irish luck or whatever, but he happened to be in a well-known relationship financially with FDR when FDR becomes the Assistant Secretary of the Navy, because Joe Kennedy is in the steel industry. And that's where, as far as I know, their original financial dealings began to overlap with each other. And you're right, the majority of his wealth came from Hollywood, and the business that he did in Hollywood, which, hello, that's mafia. And so I think there's a lot of conversation about the bootlegging, and liquor part of it, when there's actually a much bigger case to be made that he had a lot of mafia ties, at least, and every businessman did, if you were in these businesses. So don't get me wrong. I'm not like trying to say he is mafia. I'm not. But if you're going, it's just like people trying to paint Donald Trump as being a bad guy because he's in real estate in Washington, in New York City, when everything there is union. The unions are controlled by the mafia. So that's kind of, you can think of Joe Kennedy as a Donald Trump of Los Angeles. How far he was in bed with them, or whether he was just doing deals for them and he was just like Donald Trump, he's just in the, so we've seen both of these things play out in recent time. So you can make your own assessment. But the other really interesting thing, because I've seen this mentioned several times in New Orleans, there was a corresponding place in Chicago that was the big trade. Hold on a second, I'll look it up. But there was this big trading mart for commerce.
Yeah, Chicago Merchant Mart, is that what you're
talking about? Yes. So there's a corresponding one of those in New Orleans. And all of the shenanigans of the mafia doing the illegal coffee imports and all that stuff from the Caribbean all came to that New Orleans one. And a lot of those on a covert black market went to the Chicago one. So there's a lot there. And again, I do agree with you all along. Go read that book. You guys form your own opinions. We're here discussing things that we know about these things that have come up in our research. But Joe Kennedy was a big deal. No one gets to be the ambassador to UK from the US unless you are a very well-connected guy. And that leverage, whatever the leverage was, that leverage was used to get his son into the presidency. And his son decided to clean up some of the, and it may be that Joe Kennedy was exposed to so much corruption in all of the things that I just explained. He saw it in LA. And that's kind of the case we make for Trump right now, right? He helped the FBI clean up the casino thing in New Jersey. He was embroiled in real estate in New York, so he had to have seen all of that corruption. And he was in the Democrat Party, and he was in Hollywood, and maybe it made him sick. Maybe he wanted to clean it up, just as exactly what we're seeing play out in real time today. And maybe that's what happened with Joe. Maybe Joe was in all of those places, and he had a powwow with his son and said, hey, we're going to get you into the presidency, and we're going to clean this shit up. You can definitely make that argument. Alfred, go ahead.
Hi, Colonel. Hope you're doing well. We've had a whirlwind of between you, Warhamster, and Alpha. It's been pretty busy in the last
a crazy 24 hours, right?
Yeah. Really interesting stuff. And this, I'm going to have a little trouble talking about this, but I'm going to try and do my best. So the other day I was listening to someone talking kind of about personal experience. He was an older guy, and his father was in the military. And he made the claim that, he said a couple of things. Maybe I should start at the beginning. So one of the things that he was saying was that the intelligence people for the Nazis were all Jewish. In other words, they were Jewish people were running the intelligence agencies for the Nazis in World War II. And I find that interesting because you started talking about the Ritchie boys, I think, with Warhamster today.
So, right. But the intelligence network in Germany was not Jewish. Reinhard Gehlen was not Jewish. Otto Skorzeny was not Jewish. There was yeah.
That's why I find what he said interesting.
Yeah.
Right. And I think that's coming from somewhere, but I don't know from where.
Well,
I don't think he's making it up, but I just don't know. I don't have enough information.
So
I can say that.
There is an entire whole nother ball of wax that had some of the eventual Jewish people that went down to Israel that basically set up the Haggadah, their intelligence / terrorist organization down there that preceded the establishment of Israel. Now, there were German intelligence officials that worked with Jewish Zionist, World Zionist Organization officials to basically convince as many Jewish people as they could to leave Germany voluntarily. And there was an agreement with the intelligence people, and I know the guy, I see his face because I did a big research into him on the German side, and the name of the guy on the Jewish side who becomes an Israeli citizen. The two of them under the World Zionist Organization, and one was in the Nazi intelligence. They collectively worked an agreement that was blessed by Hitler to move as many Jewish people to Israel as they could, both prior to World War II, but even during World War II. They were still on this kind of underground railroad venture until you got several months into World War II, and then that entire thing broke down because of where all of the fighting was occurring. But so there was collaboration, I think would be the word I used, in all of that going on. You cannot, I don't think you can accurately say that the Nazi intelligence apparatus was Jewish, because it was not. There were collaborations between what became Jewish intel eventually in Israel, and in the lead up to that, a lot of the same people that will, several years later pop up as Mossad were working with the Germans to get the Jewish people out of.
So, I mean, think about Soros too, where when he was a little kid, he was being used to infiltrate like these families to out them to Nazi intelligence and things like that. So he was kind of an operative at a really young age to out these.
Which is,
you know the story about Soros?
Yes, I'm very familiar with it.
Okay.
But that is not any different than the Phoenix program that was used in Vietnam, or Felix Rodriguez when he was sent to a terrorist training camp at the age of 17. So yeah, that's a thing that they do. They use those young kids in those types of operations.
Okay. And I just find it, I guess I don't know enough about the Ritchie boys.
Well, you're going to.
But yeah, maybe I need to learn more. I found what you were saying, like the thing with Alpha last night was just mind blowing. So, I guess the tactic of giving out a little bit of like some information and then using that to maybe foment credibility and then misdirect.
Yes.
Right. So, that's what he was doing pretty clearly, in my opinion. I have three categories. There's like what you don't know, there's what you suspect, then there's what you pretty sure do know, right? So, I already had him in the suspect category. Like, quite frankly, when he got on Rogan, it's just my bullshit detector went off with him.
Yeah.
And so he went into I already know. But quite frankly, I feel the same way about Rogan. Like
a lot of people say that.
Yeah, I mean, back in COVID, right? He sat there and he played like a dumbass, like, does like stupid questions and doing dumb shit. And then, I think like there's some analysis of the social response, and then all of a sudden he drops in, and all of a sudden he's the hero because he's talking about ivermectin. So he's reestablishing his credibility. You know what I'm saying?
For the next stop.
Now he's still playing this bullshit, right? So there's something about him. He comes across as like a likable guy,
Yeah.
But quite frankly, Noam Chomsky and 9/11, the same thing, right? Like they talk like they say
and
something.
Noam Chomsky and JFK.
What's that?
And also Noam Chomsky and JFK, which I think is even more at a key pivotal point in the linchpin of social understanding. His lies about disinformation about JFK is like the most important disinformation. And I do call it disinformation because you have to read, and it's critical.
Huge red flag when you see. So that was exactly what I was trying to get at with those Laurel Canyon links as well, because the information he was putting out is well known, but then it was being framed in really screwed up ways, right? And I could delve into that. And
okay, Alfred.
We don't need to.
You know what you just said? What did he reveal his handle to be when he was playing that scam? What did you just say? The frame game.
I'm sorry, I don't know.
You just said the way they frame things, and Mike Ben's name in his op was called the frame game.
Oh, you're talking about Ben's. And I was actually talking about the Laurel Canyon.
No, I know, but you said I'm tying your whole conversation together. You said that these people are framing things in a particular way, and Mike Ben's name was frame game.
Correct. Yes.
It ties the whole thing together.
It's how you frame things, right? That's like
correct.
The legal world, right? Like when you go into court, it's like you're going to give testimony. It's how you frame the truth, right?
It is all about the narrative, and they learned a long time ago that when you control the words, you control the narrative, and you can control people by doing all of those things. It is exactly how you frame it. And that's exactly what that whole show last night was about.
It was very good, by the way.
Thank you. Thank you.
If anybody has not watched it, last night with Alpha Warrior, the Colonel and he went over a lot of very detailed and incredibly explosive information on Mike Benz. It absolutely makes everything make sense. That's the best way I can put it. It really is worth it. If you haven't watched it, go watch it.
And
Watch it
also,
tonight.
and also about the USS Liberty. There's a lot of information being left out about that. And I want everybody to understand the information, all of it, not just the part that they want to feed us. Miles?
I think there's more to this as well, but anyway, I won't.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Sure. Miles, go ahead.
I want to get back to the mob because we're dealing with so many criminals on this planet. So when the telegraph technology was developed, it's interesting where they laid the cables. Came from the UK, went to New York, and then it went, okay, let's go down to Australia. No, it went to Chicago. That's where it went, right after New York. So they were telling you they were going to do real-time operations from Chicago. Now, it's interesting, living in Minneapolis during Prohibition, there's caves in St. Paul and Minneapolis on the river, Mississippi River, that were speakeasies. And Al Capone used to come up here and hang out in Minneapolis, you know, kind of laying low at the speakeasies. And Colonel, just so you know, since I don't have a blue check, I'm working on the video for alphas. And it's not just going to be for warriors. It's going to be for all alphas. But since I don't have a blue check, I have to make it 2 minutes. So I want to get a lot of stuff in for 2 minutes. I don't know if I can actually melt the cheese in 2 minutes, but I'll let you know. And also, Alpha, if I DM him, he's got so many DMs. He doesn't look at it. So I'm going to have to send it to somebody.
You can send it to me. Yeah, just DM me.
Yeah, I'll send it to you.
Okay.
And you can make sure that he has. Look, it's going to be mind blowing for him to really know how to do stuff that, you know, guys that eat crayons, they don't know how to do this. So you'll enjoy it, Colonel.
Okay. All right. Anything to razz him. All along, go ahead.
Yeah, Colonel, what you're saying about Mike Benz is really intriguing, and I hope there's a way of my listening to that show. I guess maybe it was recorded, but I'm going to look into that.
It's on the Rumble channel under the Alpha Warrior program.
And I just put it above us in the pill.
Okay, thank you, Bridget.
Great. Yeah, because I'm very curious, but I just thought I'd, give my impressions of Mike Benz. And again, this is just something, it's not necessarily only important because it's my personal observations, but I'm a person who I'm like not young. I was a quote unquote leftist. I personally still consider myself a leftist. However, not that really matters. But what I think that some people don't sometimes see, like how this left-right identity stuff can really affect the entire spectrum. And specifically what I mean is this. What struck me about Mike Benz, and he's obviously said a lot of very useful information, especially around the National Endowment for Democracy period, the late 70s, early 80s. But what struck me usually over a period of time is that he really does not go after the left gatekeepers. Specifically, what I mean by that is the core of them would be Noam Chomsky, a guy named Alexander Coburn, who has a fascinating history, and our good buddy Cy Hirsch, for whom, for some reason, the folks inside CIA always seem to have a lot to say to Cy Hirsch about the years 1961 to 63. And for him to be identified with the left, quote unquote left, is kind of interesting. But, these left gatekeepers, some would argue maybe I'm a little too confident in labeling them as such. One really has to do a lot of comparison between what these purportedly left journalists wrote about, say, JFK in Vietnam, or JFK in Cuba, or JFK in Indonesia, Congo, whatever, across the board, and then actually compare them to, the peer-reviewed historians since 1998. The reason that year is significant is because that's when like more than 6 million new documents were declassified as a result of the Assassinations Records Review Board. So it was a sea change. And so when you make that comparison, that's actually a serious sample size where you can say, wow, here's Noam Chomsky repeatedly saying X, Y, and Z about JFK's Vietnam policy. And here are, like virtually every single peer-reviewed historian, including some folks who Marilyn Young, the dean of Vietnam historians at NYU, have, praised their books as revolutionary books post 1998. There's like a 180-degree, contrast, and whereas these purportedly left publications are getting a virtually complete CIA narrative about the JFK years, and it's a very interesting time to leave
follow along.
the left Lucille.
Yeah, let me help here for just a second. That is exactly the reason why I have, even when we're doing books, I refuse to use the words left and right. I'm not going to use them. To me, they're intellectually lazy because of everything you just articulated. There are things that you and I would collectively agree on that are not either right or left. And no one can, you can use terms like liberal, you can use terms like conservative, as long as you have mutual understanding and agreement as to what they mean. Because a conservative can either be a culturally conservative person, a financially conservative person, and we can collectively all agree, regardless of what our cultural or moral stance is, that we want to be financially conservative and as a country. And the whole notion of using, and we talked about that earlier, war hamster, about the use of the word left and right is to create this false dichotomy that does not exist. So it is to put us in separate pots so that we can't see over the top of the pot in order for you and I to talk about the things that we collectively agree on. So I refuse to use those labels. I will correct anybody that uses those labels because they're intellectually lazy. You tell me what you believe, and I'll tell you what I believe, and we will work together on where that overlaps, and we will not work together on where we don't overlap.
Yeah, I agree, Squirtle. I just think that that's true. But at the same time, the CIA definitely uses this idea.
The CIA created it
to manipulate the whole political spectrum.
Yes, they created it.
Moments like the JFK assassination.
Yes, they created it. They create that entire thing. Go ahead, Warhamster.
Thank you. Now, that's one of my favorite topics. We've been talking about this for a few years. First of all, to try to describe human political interactions on a two-dimensional scale is ridiculous in the first place. This whole right versus left was something that came out of the French Revolution. We started talking about leftists versus rightists. If you look at the political scale and you say far left is 100% government, meaning totalitarianism, you get the communism, you get the fascism, you get all over there on the far left where it belongs. If you take the far right, the 0% government, well, that's anarchy. Now, we know from history that anarchy will always lead to tyranny, so it's actually more of a circle that connects. What we want, what our founding fathers wanted is for a government position was as far to the right as possible, zero government, while still maintaining order. When they wrote the Articles of Confederation, that's what they thought they had. They realized 10 years in that maintaining order needed a little bit more centralized power, so they created the Constitution. So the Constitution is about 85%, well, the Articles of Confederation are about 90% of the way to the right. Constitution is probably about 80%, or the Constitution that was ratified. What it's been twisted into by amendments in modern courts is way over probably 60%, or on the left side of the middle. But it's still, when they start talking about right versus left, it's just the Hegelian dialectic, a way of dividing us. They want you, right versus left is a distraction to keep us all from looking up and seeing who's pulling the puppet strings.
Correct. 100% correct what he said. Yeah, 100%. And I do think that that is on purpose in order for us to stay divided, because we are much weaker. And honestly, that to me is one of the most profound things that happened with Trump's presidency, is it began to allow conversations that are not focused on that. It's focused on America, which is where we collectively can all work together to make it a better country. So, Carrie, go ahead. Carrie?
Sorry. Yeah, so I just want to, fire truck. I just want to talk about anarchy for a second, because anarchy is maybe misunderstood. It's anti-ideology, which if you've read Nietzsche, like Nietzsche is basically Schopenhauer, kind of, they're not, but they're like the fathers of anarchy. It's about being authentic, self-realization, and structurally, anarchy is very, very literally anti-ideology. So that when you're structurally trying to set up how to make decisions, which I have done on several continents with other people, not just Americans, you are not tied to the structure. So your structure doesn't become God. What becomes God is problem solving. Okay, this didn't solve our problem. Let's move on to a different way of making decisions. Anyway, it's not left. Anarchy is fucking not left. It's anti-left, anti-right, anti-whoever wants to smash life.
Anarchy is just zero central government, is what Warhamster was saying.
Well, I think you put it in the camp of, and it's not like a rare thing. Like, people have been fed this, right? It's not zero. I mean,
it is zero central government.
No,
yes, it is.
Yeah, it's anti-Marxist. I mean, that's why Bakunin hated Marx, because Marx wanted central command.
So the idea of having government on a continuum, you look to one end of the continuum as totalitarianism, communism, whatever. The other end of the continuum is anarchy. I don't call them right and left. They're just a continuum. And you end up going through different versions of the amount of centralized government you're going to have in whatever model you want to stop at. Because you can have a republic, you can have a democracy, you can have a totalitarian government, you can have a fascist government, you can have a Marxist government, you can have a socialist government, but you're creeping down a scale of more and more and more government in order to make that political structure work.
Well,
that's just true, Carrie.
Carrie, if I could address real quick, what you're saying, it's an accurate observation of a philosophy that I've read as well. But when I say anarchy, there's multiple versions of anarchy. You've got the libertarian version of the ANCAPs, the anarcho-capitalists, that think just doing free trade should handle all, we will be able to self-govern. I personally, I've got a lot of really good ANCAP friends. I think it's naive because there's too many crappy people in the world. But you also have the destructive anarchists, the ones who want to tear the whole thing down and see what happens just because they're haters. There's probably 5 or 6 major factions of anarchists. The way I'm using it is 100% left is tyranny, 100% right is liberty. Liberty to me is as little government as possible. I'm not, I consider myself a classical liberal, and I hate the fact that I have to use the word classical. I believe in things like free speech and due process and limited government. That should put me well over on the right, really close to an anarchy, or right around where the founding fathers were, because those are my ideological mentors. But I don't use it in the same way that it usually used in the mainstream. What I'm trying to say is we've got to get away from looking at this two-dimensional right versus left scale, because that's been done to us on purpose. That divides us. And, if you want limited government, it could be a limited monarchy. It could be a limited republic. It could be a limited, religious state. It doesn't matter if it's limited government. That's where it's going to be all the way on the right. You can still have a republic that's totalitarian. You can have a democracy, as we are seeing right now, that's totalitarian. What I'm saying is the scale is the amount of central control and government versus individual liberty.
Yeah, so I would ask you to maybe look at specifically the only thing I would say that it is anti-ideology. And that's really difficult to swallow because everything is tagged for us, like, that's a bird. You know what I mean? Like, but that's just a word we have for a bird. It's like, this is not a pipe kind of thing. Anyway, it's a philosophical discussion, and thank you, War Hamster, for being. I really appreciate you.
Always a pleasure. I appreciate you.
Okay. Tim, go ahead.
Hey, thanks, Colonel. Just a question. The Gladio operation is new for me. But I completely agree. It makes sense. I like it because it names names. But that's just one layer of corruption on top of several. And I'm a big Trump fan. I'm going to stick with him. But my question to you is, is this corruption and this rig so intertwined in our society that we could possibly get rid of it and still remain a functioning society? I mean, it's I guess, it's a cancer that's so deep. If you take cancer out, the host is probably going to go with it.
No, it's not going to go with it. To make that assumption, you would have to. So first of all, let me say that I think the effort to get rid of the cancer started a much longer time ago than any of us may ever know. So I just want to say that I think the mapping of where all of this goes was done much sooner than most of us knows. And there have been people working behind the scenes. And what I offer is a couple of examples, like Operation, oh gosh, I'm going to have a war hamster moment now. What's
Revolution?
the one in Chicago, Gray something. Shoot, I'll think of it in a second. But what it was an operation that took about 7 years, that had people that were good people assume identities in a infiltration operation by the feds and the state officials in order to determine who were the corrupt people in the operation and who were not. So I just described to you in today's thing, the one lawyer that's sitting in this law office that put locks on his doors, and he's actually an intel plant that is working. And so the mapping of where all of those people are, they're not the majority of the people. Are we going to, and as a matter of fact, I would tell you that if you look at who the actual corruptions in the past have been, if you basically could exercise the CIA apparatus around the world, you would be eliminating the majority of the people that are trafficking drugs, humans, and weapons. And if you get rid of that network, I think the rest of us, without having all of our taxes sucked out of us as we have now to pay for all of these artificial, as we talked about earlier today, our taxes are going to all of these governments to buy weapons. They're going to all of these institutions of quote unquote higher education that are fronting CIA operations and infiltration of other sorts. They're going to unions. They're going to all of these other things. I actually think there's an equilibrium that we're going to find, that by turning off one spigot, you're actually turning on the other one. And you have to believe that the people that are working through this, as what we're going to see play out starting in January, but it didn't start in January. I've talked about the taking down of one of the major linchpins in the drug networking in southern Italy, where they covertly for 2 years had captured all of the family after mapping them for years, took them to an underground facility that had been built for this purpose. It's like Guantanamo Bay underground. And they tried all of them, convicted all but like 5 of them, and there were over 300 of them. And once that was done, there were several following major, the latest of which is the TD drug money laundering scandal. Well, more than money. It was just weapons laundering. It was money laundering in general. And they just got fined almost $3 billion. And then immediately after that court case got settled, that court case was used to arrest what's the 2 sons of the one guy that's already in prison. And we just had another guy arrested today or yesterday or today here in Florida relating to the TD Bank. So there's just so much going on, but nobody's connecting the dots that they're all related to this takedown.
I hope you're right, but one of the things that really bugs me, Ghislaine Maxwell is in jail for selling underage kids for sex to absolutely nobody. Why could I think that so many bankers, well, I was going to say, if they release the Epstein files, it's going to totally wreck U.S. and European economies, and that the central banks will be shut down because not all, but a large majority of these key people are going to be Epstein clients. So how do you prepare for that? I mean, you got to have another currency waiting around for it. But I'm going to go with you. I'm optimistic. I don't want to spread any doubt. It's just like the more I learn, the bigger this problem appears, and it's big.
It is a big problem, but I do believe that they've been working on it for a very long time. And I don't believe you can't believe that it's too big and that we're not going to try. There's not anything that America has not tried to do that we've not been able to do. And this is not going to be any bigger of a challenge. And it's definitely going to be a big challenge. But I do believe that with all of us working together, and that's why, quite frankly, I'm doing what I'm doing, because I want all of us to recognize what we have in common with each other, as opposed to what they keep driving that separates us. And if we all recognize the extensiveness of the cancer, and we all begin working on exercising the cancer collectively, and we stay focused on the mission, and we don't let these ass wipes that want us to focus on our skin color or our gender or any of that, it's all an attack. It's like having somebody in your tent shooting you in the back while you're trying to march down the field towards the objective. And we're not going to collectively allow that to happen. Our ammunition is the truth. We give you truth every single day to fight the war, with your neighbors, with your family, where you can, as the fighting gets more intense, be the calm voice in the tent, where you can powwow and say, this isn't a big deal. We're working through this. Here's what's going on, and that type of thing. And I think as long as we all work together, we're going to be able to do that. So anyway, Stellar, go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to say, when the Epstein and the Weinstein and all those different lists get, you know, and even like the Virgin dude, Branson or whatever his name is, when all of these lists come out, yes, there's a lot of politicians, government people that are going to come down too, because they're a part of it. You know, a lot of things that were going on, I think, at the different islands, not only was it, say, the trafficking of the children, but it was having the, you know, the private ledgers or private bank accounts and stuff like that, which has been exposed through the blockchain. That's why, like with the RLUSD, you know, there's a fight going on between the central banks, the centralized system, and the decentralized system. And with the RLUSD, that is going to be made live very soon. I mean, the trust lines are there. That's part of, you know, cleaning out their, if you want to say, their laundering pulls through USD Tether and stuff like that. So there's a lot of stuff happening behind the scenes.
Yep. Okay.
Colonel, before you cut off, I was hoping I could spend a couple minutes addressing something that came up about half an hour ago.
Sure.
Yeah, well, I forget who said it, but someone was asking about whether there was pushback to the CIA at its formation. And some interesting comments. I thought I'd give a real brief history. I know you've covered a lot of this stuff, but to answer that question specifically, what I would say is we never had intelligence agencies during peacetime until after World War II. And what really brought that about, you know, after the war was over, the OSS was supposed to disband. In fact, it did. Constitutionally, it had to disband. So there was a discussion over whether we should have an intelligence agency during peacetime. And if so, would it just be intelligence gathering or intelligence gathering plus covert actions? A guy by the name of George Kennan, who I know you've discussed, was the U.S. ambassador to Russia at the time of the Soviet Union. And he wrote what's called the Long Telegram, where he basically said the U.S. could no longer draw an unmistakable line between war and peace. And what he was recommending was covert action was, you know, basically any action that didn't precipitate direct military action. He was basically giving the okay. Now, at the same time, Truman, who's from Missouri, is surrounded by a group of people called the Missouri Gang. A bunch of people he brought to D.C. with him that were loyal to him. And there are a couple names that are worth mentioning. One guy, Roscoe Hillenkoetter, would become the first director of the CIA, and he was pushing back against covert action. He did not want his agency to be doing direct kinetic action. Obviously, he lost that fight in a couple of years, and the Missouri Gang kind of got squeezed out by more D.C. people. Interesting name on the Missouri Gang was a White House lawyer by the name of Clark Clifford, who we just talked about in BCCI. That's kind of cracked me up, but the thing that really set it apart was the Doolittle Commission, which in 1954. And that's where Doolittle basically just said there could be no rules in the game. And at the end of the day, we got the CIA we have today. But there was internal discussions and different power plays to see what the CIA could become or would become. And we know which side won that argument. So hopefully that helps answer that question.
Oh, and that's a great addition. Great information. And the other part of the question was, were they doing the same kind of stuff prior? And yes, they were. It
was privatized.
Correct. And what's the weird thing about it was what happened when they reduced the CIA under Jimmy Carter. They just reprivatized it. So, yeah.
And same thing they did after the Cold War ended, and we realized we couldn't be doing these covert actions. We started using the NGOs and some of the other members of Mike Benz's blob.
Yeah. So, very interesting. All along?
Yeah, picking up on that point about how that Helen Carter's resistance to the DC-ization of the CIA. I think it's noteworthy that in 1953 and 1954 and 1955 is the key organization of the Office of Policy Coordination. Oh shoot, darn! But the organization that's set up to be the liaison between National Security Council and the executive departments that is post-policy approval, and that was first run by C.D. Jackson, the same dude who later obtains the Zapruder film in 1963, who's just a guy who's just incredibly under-discussed, in my opinion. And he is replaced by Nelson Rockefeller in 1955. And this is like an area that is just surrounded by, darkness, because these folks in the Office of Policy Coordination, because it's easy to mix it up with several other lettered groups that are right before it. But that group is surrounded in mystery because they were a coordinating group, ostensibly not a policy making group, and their job was to implement policy already approved by the president, and they were supposed to coordinate it with all of the executive departments. There's a lot of leg room there because it was post-approval for a lot of shenanigans and growth of sort of off-the-books executive department, deep shenanigan, as it were. And JFK abolished that OCB in February 1961. And at the time of the Bay of Pigs failure, there was a little bit of commentary in the print press about how, maybe JFK's abolishing of the OCB what resulted in the Bay of Pigs, quote, confusion. I think that's a misleading way of saying it, but it's significant that the OCB, was formed in those 53 to 55 years, and God knows what Nelson Rockefeller was doing in 1955. Sorry, I had to say it again.
Well, I can tell you what he was doing because that big, ginormous 700-page book I'm reading tells exactly what he was doing on that committee. And he was not implementing policy. He was creating the policy, and he was doing it largely around a group of people that will later be the ones that goes down and kills all the indigenous Indians in Latin America. Spoiler alert. Okay. So, great segue. I think that's, oh, look at you, Stellar. I love your picture. That's so cute. All right. Great space today, guys. I appreciate everyone being here. Definitely looks like our, so I would like to know if you guys will go over to the comments area of X. I want to know two things for everybody's in here. So please at me on your post so I can see it, and tell me, is the sound better? And is it easier to find the space now that we're not using the term Operation Gladio? Because there is a lot more people in the space today. And I have gotten only two that I know that have continued to have sound issues since we changed the name. So please go over and in your normal area. I see everybody give me a thumbs up. So I'm going to assume things are much better, which it really pisses me off. I gotta tell you. So that would be
we will beat the algorithm. Sometimes, what do they say? To win a war, you have to lose a battle.
So what's very interesting to me is the last 2 days, and I know he's very busy and on a completely different time zone, but Guru, the next time we see him in here, I have to be able to thank him because this was his brilliant idea. I don't know why. I don't know if I would have just been stubborn enough not to do it. But the whole reason we're here is to share the information. So of course I would have done it, but I would have done it as grudgingly as I did it. But now that we know that is what they're censoring, I think that tells us a lot in general, that the information that we are sharing matters. And I just think it's hilarious because those of you who've been with me on and Bridget and Cousin It on this whole journey, you are seeing everything that we've talked about, right? We did a whole series on South Korea, and then what pops up? South Korea. You guys know all of the history of, I mean, not all of it, the relevant history of the government and the interaction with the US government and the overthrows of the government. So now when you read about the president and the martial law and their chief of police, their chief of police guy is completely corrupt because we've explained how that whole thing works. They're bought off, they're installed because they don't check the ports, they don't check the seaports or the airports, and they allow drugs to come and go and blah, 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 because we went through that with the Philippines. Then you have, Syria. We went through much of the Middle East, and you understand exactly what's going on because you can immediately see, oh, look, there's a picture. There's a guy from the Mujahideen. There's a guy in there from Al-Qaeda. There's a guy in there from ISIS, and they're trying to tell us those are the freedom fighters, and then they install an Al-Qaeda operative in as the new president. Come on. So those are all of the things that we have learned over the last year and a half of exposing all of this information. And then what happened? It was months ago that we did the shows on the USS Liberty. And everybody else is now being exposed to it because of a much bigger platform, thankfully, picked up that story and ran with it. But you guys already know it. And you're kind of like, yeah, okay, we got it. So I want you guys to pat yourselves on the back because, again, I keep saying this and I'm going to keep saying it. Much of the information that we get hints and sources from you guys. You give us books to read, you give us articles to read, and videos to watch. And I couldn't be more thankful for such an intelligent audience. Andy, did you want to say something really quick?
Yeah, just really quick. And what worries me is that now we're hyper aware, like you mentioned about Syria. So when we hear the slogan where people are talking about about Assad and blaming him as being, the tyrant of, and where I know because of having my wife having family there that they actually love Assad, right? But that aside, when you hear it's the same narrative coming from politicians and here in Canada from both sides. So you have the current government, tweeting about it, and then also the opposition, the guy who will likely become the next prime minister, is also tweeting the same narrative. So that sort of brings a bit of fear in me that like they're both on the same wavelength, or they're both brainwashed. I don't know.
But now you recognize it. And when they start using certain terms and they start supporting different things, we're now all collectively much smarter. And the other thing, I can't say this enough, and I said it on Alpha's show last night, we all sit in our own little, because we are the very definition of independent thinkers. We are independent people. We like being independent. We like exercising our self-preservation skills, but there is a need for us collectively to gather together and educate each other and to share information. And we don't tend to do that enough, where the enemies do it every day, and they have well-defined institutions, organizations, and money to do it all with. And I cannot say enough, if you think it needs to be said, you need to say it, because you don't know how many other people are thinking the same thing, or have information that either confirms what you're saying or refutes what you're saying. And we're all functioning adults, so we can take information that doesn't match with our perception, filter it through what we do know, and accept the pieces that you believe to be true. Just because someone comes into a space and wants to refute something that you say doesn't mean they know anything. It may not mean that they know something, and it may mean that they know a whole lot more than you do on that subject, and you need to go back and rethink what you think you know. And I've had every bit of that happen to me, especially throughout my learning career. But even in this process, we collectively thought that we understood the World Anti-Communist League as just being kind of this front group. We were completely unaware of how big that freaking thing was and how important it was to the overall development of Operation Gladio across the world. And I was floored, quite frankly, and had someone a year ago, and I do know there's people out there that knew this, and had one of those people come into our space and goes, "Oh, honey, you don't even know the half of it," and told me what we eventually found about the World Anti-Communist League. I don't honestly know if I'd have believed them. I would have let them talk. I would have let y'all be exposed to that information, but I would have been highly skeptical, I have to tell you. And those are the whole way that you learn things. But my lesson in this whole last 24 hours is put the information out there. If you think something odd's going on, and it may be an operation, put the information out there. Let all of our network source it, come back and look for things. And within a couple of hours, I was inundated with, "Oh my God, this is, so-and-so did a thread on that. So-and-so did a thread on that." So now I have a ton more information to form my opinion. And my opinion was confirmed with my thought process. Cousin Ed, I'm going to let you, teamwork. Cousin Ed, I'm going to let you close it out, and then I've got to go.
I just want to know who the hell you're calling a functional adult.
Okay.
I'm sorry.
None of us in here. She's not referring to any of us in here. We're functional kids.
Right. I mean, really? Couple of things. You don't know if anybody had an opportunity to notice our little ISIS buddies calling out the United States and the CIA handler taking away his mic.
Yeah, I shared that again too. That was good.
Was that not funny? I mean, I thought.
So explain that. Explain that for anybody who's not seen it.
So, after Assad obviously is not there anymore, you have all this bullshit going on in the streets, and, we're taking Syria back and blah, 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 blah. And and there's this clearly white guy standing there in front of him as he's speaking on the podium. And then all of a sudden he starts calling out the evil empire of the West, and the white guy grabs the mic from him
and shoves him down.
You may not do that. So that's fun thing number one today. And fun thing number two is President Trump decided to put up a survey, right, a poll on his page today that asked what the biggest danger to the United States is. And of course, he lists Russia, China, Iran, or other. Well, I'm sure y'all have figured out what my answer to that was, but I'm going to let everybody decide. I've reposted that that survey. I highly recommend everybody put in their 2 cents, such as it were, because Mike Pompeo, funny enough, decided to pipe in from left field to talk about how wonderful Israel is and how, thank God, Israel saved us from the chemical weapons that Syria had. Really, dude? Really? So anyway, that's my little fun for the day, aside from everything going on in the Russian news, which I posted. But God bless everyone. Have fun.
Okay, Carrie, I'm gonna let you go first tomorrow. I've got to run. I've got dinner that needs to get off the grill. But I thank everybody for being here, and we will reconvene tomorrow. I only have one show tomorrow, and we'll be back here at 4 o'clock. So thanks, everybody. Okay, so I'm not sure that I answered the question about the coup. I wish we were told Wizard of Oz was a documentary. There's definitely, I mean, obviously, if you've been here for a while, Eureka Springs, you know that I call that entity the International Syndicate. And no, I don't try to define it. I have no way or intelligent sources to be able to do that. There's some people that stick out in investigations that you know are part of that crowd. But because you can't technically define it without sources of intel, I don't spend a lot of time on who's in the club and who's not in the club. I concentrate on educating us on our history that we've missed. So hope that helps. But you're definitely right that there was a coup in 63. Some people think McKinley murder was that his death in office was not an accident, and that was a coup as well. Nixon obviously was taken out by the CIA with the plumbers and the Cuban exile gangs that were sent in there to stage that whole thing. So whatever it was he did that pissed everybody off, who knows? And let's see what else you got. You are stubborn in getting results. Yes, SR71, I am very stubborn. I actually prefer the word persistent. My dad called me stubborn. I decided that I liked persistent better. It sounds much more sophisticated. Not that that applies to me, but okay. What else we got? OSCENT shows Syrian rebels have obtained thousands of man pads now. Chemical weapon story seems like a big distraction. So obviously, the information that is floating around in military circles is that a lot of the weapon systems that supposedly was going to Ukraine has been put on the black market. And a part of the black market supplies, and to include ones that were left in Afghanistan, has made their way into Syria, and that there was basically a staging of around the outside surroundings in all of those pockets where there are fighters that had holed up in Syria, that had Trump won, that they were going to launch a full-scale attack to overthrow, no kidding, because obviously they've been trying to overthrow Assad for a very long time, but they realized that the clock was clicking at that point to basically they're not going to have a choice to readdress it if they didn't do it at that point. So basically they like scarfed up everything they had and made a run for it. So I think the whole Syria thing, obviously a regime change by the intelligence agencies and NATO aligned Western people. We know what it's for. It's to continue the pipelines that have been on hold all of this time, because Syria was not going to be under the thumb of the West, and he would not agree. They wined and dined him in UK when all of this started, and he still said, no, you're not going to own Syria. You're not going to use the pipeline to control my country. And he became the evil empire at that point. So this is just a continuation of all of that. So anyway, thank you guys for being here. I appreciate it. And we will be back tomorrow at 4 o'clock here. Thanks for joining us.